Hello everyone, how's it going? Welcome back. This is Mimir's Well number 15, and joining me today is a very special guest. Let me bring him up here. How's it going, JF? You are now live on screen.
It's going very well. I'm glad to be here.
So today we're just going to have a nice little chat about a couple of topics that I wanted to pick your brain over. And I figured we would start with biology because I am by no means a specialist in biology. That would be your field. And I had a couple questions. And in particular, I had some questions about your book, The Revolutionary Phenotype. And I'll sort of tie it into the rest of the conversation there. But to start out with, before we get things rolling, what is it about science and biology in particular that interests you so much?
Well, it all started when I was very young. I mean, I must have been 6 or 7 when I was living in the forest. I was going in the back of my home at my parents' house, and I would go in the forest. I would gather insects. So I think it's just an instinct inside of me to be fascinated by life. Now, it developed really progressively like this, and from the very start I was fascinated by trees, by insects. I was catching butterflies. Then in teenage years I was looking at fish reproducing. So it dates back for as long as I can tell. When the Jurassic Park movie came out, I was a big fan of Jurassic Park. So it's of course you face all these complex things, and you're like, okay, there's some very special thing in this universe that's happening for this to happen. And the final answer to this, I understood it perhaps around somewhere between 18 years old and 25 years old in my discovery and understanding of Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, which I believe I've read very early. I think I was 13 or 14 when I read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins in French. And,
Oh, wow.
and then I learned English more and more, and eventually I read it in English. And I think I fully grasped the power of this theory around 23 years old. I had a completed understanding of the power of Richard Dawkins' conception of genes.
Right. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, it's a good answer. I would say that as far as I'm concerned, science, I think there's something natural within me and I think also within you that forces us to seek the truth, you know? And a lot of that can be found through science. You know, whether we get to the right answer or not, at least we're trying to get where we want to. We're trying to find the truth. And biology was always interesting to me, but I was more on the chemistry side, and I ended up in technology as a career now. So that's a good answer. So I'm not really familiar with Richard Dawkins. I read the God Delusion a couple of years, maybe about 10 years ago. For people who are interested in getting into his books, where do you think that they should start?
I'm sorry, I was replacing my thing here. It was about to fall. Someone interested in Richard Dawkins? Well, the great thing with Richard Dawkins is it's accessible to anyone. So you just buy a copy of the Selfish Gene, you buy a copy of the Extended Phenotype, and you're good to go. That the great minds of our time, they find a way to package the information so that it's accessible to everyone. That's one of the great aspects of Richard Dawkins, at least his early work. It was that it was accessible to everyone, and it is still accessible to everyone. And I'm writing my own book, which I consider to be a follow-up on some of the ideas of Richard Dawkins, which I consider are incomplete, and I push them to the most extreme that they were ever took. And I want my book also to be just as good for someone who's read no other book.
Right. Yeah, that was the great thing is I read it a little while ago, and for those who haven't seen it, I'm sure that I'll post a link to it. But it was very accessible, even for someone who isn't as familiar with biology as some other people might be. I understood it fairly well, and that's the great thing. And I'm excited to read the rest of it. And I don't know if you want to give us some spoilers. I've got some questions. We'll get
Yeah,
there.
I'm up to discuss. Essentially, all of the content of the book is prepared. It's all a matter of working on the formulation. So the first chapter is out there at bookjfg.world,
That's right.
book.jfg.world. And the rest of the work on this book is really to frame it so that it's accessible to everyone. But all of the major ideas are there. And I've discussed all of these ideas in some videos here and there. So there's no secret, really. I consider that the book contains a completed theory of how life emerges, how genetic codes emerge, because this was the last thing that was not really addressed by Richard Dawkins. How does the first replicator emerge? And the answer is quite stunning, and it's an answer that we've come at the culmination of about 70 years of thinking about this. We now have a final answer. Life forms are created by other life forms, which is absolutely stunning, which no one really had seen come, but that's the conclusion of current science.
Right. Yeah. So the main thing that I wanted to touch on, because I'm interested in futurology, and you mentioned it briefly in your book, is the revolutionary phenotype the biggest threat to humanity in your eyes?
Absolutely.
Because I think that the transhumanist movement as well is also one of the biggest threats that could potentially come up if we don't get a rein in on technology as it stands right now.
I mean, transhumanism is already in progress, if you will. Our keyboards, our mouse computers, we've already interfaced with the virtual world. And we did it always in our interest. So no one is connecting to, well, no one, I shouldn't say no one, but the vast majority of the contribution of computers to civilization are positive. They allow everyone to be more productive. They allow people who don't become addicted in extreme cases. They allow things that are good, things that make us more productive, more intelligent, more educated, and more able to go by our daily lives, including more able to reproduce. I know that it's heartbreaking for a lot of people who have been thinking about transhumanism as a bad thing. And I think there could be bad things, but in the long run, when I think over thousands of years, I realize that these bad things will be compensated for. They will be forgotten by humans if they really are dangerous to humans. No one will put a chip in their brain if it becomes unhealthy to put a chip in your brain. And so as long as the state of liberty is preserved and that people can continue evolving, we will evolve away from bad technologies. An AI that would manipulate humans to its own needs, we would see it coming. We would nuke the shit out of it. And so that's why I'm not so worried. Now, the concept of a revolutionary phenotype is much more dangerous and much more subversive.
So you see a difference between transhumanism and the revolutionary phenotype? Because I was talking to some people about it, and they saw it almost as a one-to-one relationship, but they're two different concepts. Is that correct?
Well, it depends, because you can easily say that a revolutionary phenotype is a subset of transhumanism. It's a special type of interaction between a life form and technology. So if you want to make transhumanism as a large family, I would say all of these processes are not worrying to me in the long run for the existence of humans, except the special case of revolutionary phenotypes. Revolutionary phenotypes are the ones that can actually undermine your existence while you don't even realize it. It will eventually replace you completely.
Right, and I'll get there. I have some questions about that here in a second, but I wanted to start out with this question here. Why are the proponents of memetics, such as Susan Blackmore or Daniel Dennett, incorrect in your opinion? And by correct, I mean that memes are not a replicator necessarily.
Yeah, so that's a question I address in the book. So why is memetics wrong? Memetics is not always wrong. Memetics tries to see a replicator in human culture. Now, replicators. So if you wanna say that anything that makes a copy of itself is a replicator, then the attribution of the word replicator as a descriptive term to memes is not false. There is some information in my brain. I talk to you, the information gets in your brain, and to that extent, yes, memes are replicator. But the original error by Richard Dawkins, which was a very small error, but it actually expanded into an entire field with with departments that have expanded this little error, this little imprecision, I would say. I would not accuse Richard Dawkins of having made the error, in fact, because he has warned in his own book about this. However, is the followers of Richard Dawkins, like Susan Boyle, like Daniel Dennett, they have taken this concept too far without caring for one detail. And the detail is, I present this idea in my book as being solved by by imagining a trickster printer. So a trickster printer is you just have to imagine that things that make copies of themselves, they have to use some aspect of their environment. Even DNA, it has to be in some water. There has to be proteins around it to make copies of it. And so you can think of all these processes as a printer. And to be subject to Darwinian evolution, you need your printer to be unbiased, if you will, or at least biased toward your interest as a replicator, which is the case with DNA. DNA produces cells that accumulate water around DNA, accumulate all of the ions that are needed. It also produces proteins. And so everything that's around DNA at the moment of copying is a good printer. What do I mean by good? And from a purely Darwinian sense, not a moral sense, but good because it makes copies, and when it makes errors, these errors are random. So the process of copying DNA is not biased evolutionarily.
Right.
The process of copying memes between brains is biased evolutionarily. Why? Because the printer of memes, which is our brains, is filled with emotions that are encoded by neurons. These neurons are produced by DNA. And so that the process I did right there, I call it tracing the root. So when you look at a printer that prints things, you need to trace the root of its evolutionary interest. I will give you an example of rooting. Take the tip of your finger. It's made with biological cells. These biological cells, they contain proteins. These proteins are produced by RNA strands. These RNA strands are produced by DNA. DNA is copied into your body from the original embryo, the zygote, the first cell when the sperm of your parents met the egg of your other parent. And so there I've rooted the tip of your finger down to its replicative unit, which is the sperm and egg of your parent, and ultimately across generation, the sperm and eggs of all of your descendants and ancestors. If you root human culture like this, you go back to the sperm and egg too. So the rooting of human culture is a printer that has another evolutionary interest than the replication of the meme itself. It is the replication of the DNA strands that produce brains that can carry the meme. And that's where I call it not just a printer, but a trickster printer. It's a trickster printer because ultimately the DNA strands, they don't care about propagating Islam or propagating Catholicism. They care about surviving, and they're gonna lie about the memes. They're gonna change the meme. And one example I give in my book is, suppose that there was a meme that spreads on Twitter that says "make moral babies." And everyone gets this meme and they start transmitting it to their children, and everyone is like, let's make moral babies, let's make them as moral as possible. And you end up having a part of the population that's been exposed to this meme, and because they spend so much time making their babies moral, that they actually invest energy, and as a consequence they have less time to make more babies. Then you have a trickster printer that emerges in the population. I call it the trickster. So the trickster guy is a guy who changes all letter every time he encounters the letter AL, he changes it for the letter E. And so make moral babies become make more babies. And every time this guy receives messages on his Twitter account telling him, make your babies more moral, he changes it and he says, no, I need to make more babies, not moral babies. And this guy, what would happen is that his babies that would carry the trickster printer genes, they would outcompete everyone around them because they wouldn't care about making their babies moral. They would care about making more of them. And so that's why that's how human culture evolves. Actually, it's by having trickster that change it according to their need. And the reason why today you look at all major religions and they're all anti-homosexuality, they're all targeted toward making you make more babies. The explanation by Susan Ball and Daniel Dennett do not hold. They don't explain why are all religions like this. Why aren't there self-perpetuating memes that are bad for humans? Because according to their view, that's what they should predict. And in fact, Susan Boyle has literally said it, that she could not understand why are all the memes so good to have people make babies. And she was stunned when she learned that atheists in America make less babies than Christians. And she had to step back a little bit on some of her statements. I don't know what's her current state of belief. I will go forward and say it instead of her. She was wrong. She was wrong. Memetics does not explain how culture evolves. Gene evolution does.
Right. Am I correct in thinking that something like DNA is like hardware in a computer and something like memes is more like a software in computer? It serves two purposes, or something else?
I don't like this metaphor. I mean, a lot of people do it. I don't see it that way. The way I see it is DNA is a replicator. The rest of the universe is the phenotype. And right. That's how you need to think of things if you want to think evolutionarily. Now you can make all sorts of metaphor. The brain is the hardware, the IDs are the software, but really the way DNA interacts with the physical universe is by being its own thing, completely separate of what I call the phenotype, which includes both things that are inside your body and things that are outside your body.
Okay, yeah, I was taking questions from the audience, and some people were trying to fully grasp it by using an analogy or a metaphor. I just wondering if that was a correct summation. All right, cool. So the next thing, we'll kind of shift here a little bit. Technology as a replicator. I think this is something that I fear the most. Is it possible to see technology as a replicator of kinds? With how interconnected the world is becoming, we've got huge advances in AI. We may see a day that technology can self-replicate without human interaction. This is something that I fear greatly. Do you see something like this happening? Would that make technology a replicator in that instance?
Absolutely. It's possible to see it as a replicator, but we should not make the same error that Susan Boyle and Daniel Dennett have done with human culture and think that this gives them access to the evolutionary function, because as it turns out, it doesn't necessarily. The conditions under which this thing becomes dangerous to humans is a revolutionary phenotype. So let's develop a new term, which I call in my book embedded replicators. So they are replicators that live within the boundaries of your phenotype being determined by your DNA replicators. So embedded replicators are not a problem evolutionarily. I mean, we have millions of them inside of us. First, all of our cells, they are embedded replicator, except the sperm and the egg, which are really the only carriers of the DNA genes that actually are subject to evolution. So we've handled quite well embedded replicators before. In fact, all of our bodies are made of embedded replicators. We also have embedded replicators outside of our bodies. Human culture is somewhere in between, because human culture lives inside of our body, but it gets transmitted from brain to brain. And so it's a kind of individual independent replicator that travels across individual. Another embedded replicator are cows, dogs, all of the animals and the plants that live into our phenotype are embedded replicator. And you know, you could be worried that computers will eventually outperform humans because they will self-replicate, but we don't have these worries for cows, we don't have these worries for pigs, we don't have these worries for octopuses. So
we might see a day where our pig overlords stick us in vats one day. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, that's essentially Planet of the Apes.
Right.
Planet of the Apes is a case of a phenotypic, it's not a phenotypic revolution. I call it separately. When the replicator is an embedded replicator, I call it a phenotypic separation. Now, a phenotypic separation, the thing is, it's very unlikely that it happens, simply because replicators that are embedded like this, they interact with each other such that they improve each other with time, so that they both converge toward a mutually beneficial relationship. The same way cows were improved over time. The more we go through time, the more cows are good for humans. And in fact, that's another thing that people may ignore, but the more humans are good for cows. We produce a better environment for cows, and the cows produce better meat for us. That's what happens with embedded replicator. They co-evolve toward cooperation. Now, what would be a phenotypic separation that could be worrying? It could be a replicating robot that eventually finds itself a place in human society, eventually uses that place to reach the higher ranks of human society, and eventually decides to destroy humanity. Now, for many people, they're like, Jeff, you should be worried about this. And I say to these people, it's still nukeable. And I know you're going to say, Jeff, you're kind of a psycho. Your threshold for something to be really dangerous is that it's not nukeable. Yeah, because when you start thinking about phenotypic revolution, let me tell you, the revolutionary robots, they look like choir children singing songs in the church. They're so easy to eradicate, which is why I'm not that worried. Now, I would be worried if we let it happen progressively, but there would be times for people to call to action. There would be military intervention. There would be civil wars with the robots. And eventually we could win without killing ourselves. A revolutionary phenotype, once it starts, you can't win, because the revolutionary phenotype is part of you. But we'll get there.
All right. Well, that scares the shit out of me, but you're right. There's always the nuke option, and I think the only thing we should be afraid of are things that don't die when we nuke them. But real quick here, I got a question or something that someone said in the chat. The Shadow in the Mask says, I'm not some backwards boony boomer, but I'm not sold on evolution. It's still just a theory until proven beyond a doubt. Science isn't there. Now, what in the world can you say to these people? Because for a long time, I've tried to reach folks with the theory of evolution, because I went to an inner city school, and most people there had no idea what evolution or natural selection was. A lot of them were Baptist Christians, creationists, and it was very hard for me to get through to them that these ideas are not just a theory, it's a scientific theory. Is there a way that you reach these people, or do you just flat out ignore them and let them do their own thing?
Yeah, it's like, it's my attitude as a teacher that the human mind is not always prepared to learn. And so I kind of abandon these people. But if he reached out to us, maybe it's because he has some openness. I will tell you, I won't convince you of evolution if you're not starting this whole conversation with, I want to know the truth about the world. Now, if I can get you on this, if you're interested in the truth, then you're going to look at around you, and you're going to look at the theory of evolution first. What is it? Well, let's take the restatement of the the natural selection principles in the same way John von Neumann and Dawkins did, and I will simplify it to simply say there are things that make copies of themselves. Do you agree or do you not agree? Now, of course, he would say, I agree. Okay, these things, they make copies of themselves. They also make other things. Do you agree? And then he would have to say, well, yeah, of course. Anything does anything. Even a desk left on the street, it does change the patterns of wind. Any physical object has some output in the world. All right, so there are things that make copies of themselves. These things do other things. Now, the theory of evolution is essentially the set of mathematical consequences that these two statements have in per theoretical term, true terms. Not in terms of telling you, okay, so the beetle in your living room comes from a bacteria. No. Let's forget about this. These two statements I just said, they have huge mathematical consequences. The big consequence being the relationship between the thing that makes copies of itself and the rest of the world. Because imagine that there's a thing that makes copies of itself, and that thing happens to create stuff in the universe that lead to it making even more copies of itself. Now imagine some other thing that makes copies of itself, but it's not very good at making copies of itself. What do you think will happen after 1 million years? And hopefully, if our guy here on the chat is quite honest, you would say, well, the things that are good at making copies of themselves will outnumber the things that are bad at making copies of themselves. That is the essence of natural selection. Now, put that over 4 billion years, and you can get amazing effects.
Right. Now, we have a follow-up to his initial comment there. He says, but it's not about religion, it's about bad science. And then he goes on to say, but mutations are a loss of information. Microevolution is solid, but no one has observed one species becoming another. This is something that I've heard quite frequently as well. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, those are our typical argument. This guy has read some anti-evolutionary literature. Look, if we were to engage on an actual honest search for truth, I would have you in front of me and I would ask you, do you agree with the statements that I've done and the mathematical consequences that I've pronounced on these statements? Now, on the question, did we ever observe a species become another species? We actually may. I mean, we see huge changes that birds go through on various islands. We see in laboratory bacteria completely changing style in terms of how they react to various chemicals. And so the thing is, you don't seem to realize that species, to start with, is an arbitrary label. Species is a label that we give to put animals into groups because they can't reproduce together as far as we know. But the reality of life is much more complex than this. There are subspecies, and we know that there are subpopulations within subspecies, and the amount of reproduction that happens between these is on a continuum rather than an arbitrary line, the way species is defined. The thing is, you seem to be obsessed with questions that are absolutely irrelevant. The theory of evolution is independent of the concept of species. And you're taught that, oh, we never saw it happen. All right, but we never saw all sorts of other things happen, yet we can see their consequences in the physical universe, and we can drag inferences. I mean, there is no explanation to why lions have DNA strands that we also have as human, and they're almost perfect copies, or they are perfect copies depending on the level of preservation. There is no explanation other than this. Then you can triangulate from current life forms into the past, and they share a common ancestor.
Louise Goff Beardsley says, "Uh-oh, evolution cuck detected." Well,
evolution cuck.
Yeah. There's a follow up to that, but I think we're getting caught on that. I was curious as to what your question would be. So, finally, the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about on this revolutionary phenotype, the big threats to humanity, is this Deus ex machina, will humans reach a point in which we can control our biology? And I mean down to the production of, let's say, proteins and peptides. I think that one day, if we don't figure out how badly we're trying to play God here, that there's going to be repercussions that we might not know of. Let's see here.
Absolutely. And my book tells humanity, here's what will happen if you modify a single baby genetically. It will unfold over, I tend to give a range, which is, it cannot, the story I'm about to tell you can unfold in about 10,000 years, or it can unfold in about 1 million years, or even maybe 10 million years. But it happens within this range, and those are the consequences if you today, if within the next 5 years, the next 10 years, if we modify one human baby genetically, this is what will happen. So what will happen is, first, this baby will be more successful. He's going to be improved in some way. Or if this one, the first one we do, is not improved, we're going to work on our techniques and work on our knowledge, and we're going to make another baby eventually that will have less diseases, that will have better IQ, or whatever it is that we try to optimize, it's going to be good. And this baby will make more babies. And the babies of the original baby you modified, they will also want a right to modify themselves. And the computers that produce the recommendations for these babies to get better and better, they will keep improving. And all of their babies will all have rights. And eventually you'll have other people into humanity saying, hey, we also want to modify our genes. Look at how successful these guys are. And you're going to improve a whole section of humanity. And they will have less disease, they will live longer, they will produce more babies. And their babies will produce more babies, and their babies will produce more babies, until the point where not a single person on planet Earth will not have been modified through this eugenics program. Not a single person on this earth will be not affected by the decisions of a computer. Now you might say, well, that sounds actually pretty good. Yeah, up to there, it's pretty good. Now, what are you going to get now? So you have a complete population replacement, and you have a complete eradication of any natural human being on Earth. They've been replaced, outperformed by better, more healthy, more beautiful beings. Which are, every time they want babies, they go to a clinic, they type on a computer some of their preferences, and the computer generates a set of recommendations that they can print into their own genome, so that when they pass, maybe in the genome of a sperm cell, an egg cell, somehow we will find a way to print the genes of your future babies. And it will all be according to, one, what the computer knows about human health and what you want as a parent. All right, so at this point, we're printing old genomes, and we're making little tweaks to make them better and better. Now, at this point, the bits on the computer are just as much your genome as your genome. In other words, because you always pass through the computer, it really doesn't matter the DNA strand that's in your body. What determines your success and the success of your line of descent is ultimately the data that's stored on the computer. And the data that's stored on the computer, not only does it produces your babies, it produces the babies of everyone. And so at this point, most likely you will be unable to have your own babies. People will just evolve not to be able to have a penis-vagina interaction. Why? Because going to the clinic is better. And so anyone who's actually able to make natural babies will not be able to benefit from this new technology. And so what do you have? You have people actually evolving a retraction of their vagina and penis structure so that everyone is forced to go to the clinic. So at this point, the AI, the computer, even if it's not very intelligent, even if it's just a bunch of bits on a very old computer, this thing has taken over your cycle of reproduction, your liberty to mutate, and your liberty to be selected for in nature, as it occurs right now when when you have successes and failures in life, it determines whether you will get your penis into a vagina. And so now it doesn't matter anymore once you reach the stage where all of the success of humanity is determined by a sequence of bits, not in your DNA, a sequence of bits on a hard drive in a clinic. Now, at this point, you'll have a computer starting to maybe schedule some stuff for humanity that you may not want, but some stuff that will make it better, but not better from your perspective, better from the perspective of the computer. So why not remove some ego here and there? Why do we have all these human beings having ego? It's much better if we neutralize it. It's much better if we remove these emotions. After all that the computer cares about is having a good city of good humans who don't compete with each other. They all work with each other to the interest of the one thing that matters, the survival of the bits on the hard drive of the computer. And so then the computer starts modifying your babies very slightly every generation, making them more and more docile, making them incapable of even wanting something good for themselves. Because what matters is how much money they can bring to the clinic when they want to have babies. And sometimes it will be good for you also. Sometimes the computer will say, well, it's good to have someone with a little bit of dreams, but maybe it's not good to have someone who wants to be self-protective, who wants to care about his reproduction. Maybe it's not good to have someone who may have interests that are contrary to the clinic. And so progressively what you see is over thousands of years is a change in humans so that they are not units of self-survival, they are units of abandonment of all of their interests to the greater good, the survival of the computer and the improvement of the computer. Now, this is the first step of the phenotypic revolution, which is called the replicator tango, and we're through it. So at this point, you still have humans, but these humans are completely enslaved by the AI. The second stage of a phenotypic revolution is the exit of the replicator tango. That's where one day you're going to have one humans in these clinics who's going to have a very bad idea. He's going to think, how about I take the bits on the computer hard drive and I start transmitting them to friends in other towns who work in other clinics. And then the bits on the hard drive will become self-replicative. So the bits on the hard drive have acquired independence of humans because they can travel from town to town. And they start seeding other enslaved humans in other towns. And then we'll find out that, yeah, enslaved human cities are doing better. These creatures that are human-like, but that are completely egoless and that are willing to die for the computer, this is good. It works well. We kill everyone else.
Venus so Rising says this is terrifying. So, to everyone in the chat, I'd love to interject, but I want to just hear him go full force here, so I'm just going to let him talk as long as he wants to. So whenever you're done, just let me know, and then I'll get to the next couple of questions here. So go ahead.
All right. So these humans who are enslaved, who have no emotions, no willingness to survive. In fact, they don't care surviving. They will kill themselves if needed for the good of the computer because they know that their baby's existence does not rely on them. It relies on the computer. And you will start having service rewards. All right, if you die for the clinic that carries the computer bits, will produce babies for you even after your death. And now you'll have humans completely enslaved, and you have the computer bits that can start traveling. They can start seeding new groups of humans that are all ethnocentrically related and dominate the planet progressively. Eventually, you might have civil wars, but all of it could happen in complete silence. It could just deploy onto humanity without a single person crying, without a single person dying. We would just get replaced progressively by groups of organized humans who care more for their computer than themselves. And Now, once the computer has acquired this ability to reproduce, now the human is not even a needed step in its cycle. Humans will continue being produced by these computers as long as they serve. But if they can be turned into bits of what they used to be, if we can actually create human arms without the human mind, without human shoulders, why wouldn't we produce human arms? It's much more efficient. You don't need to get the human arms through school. You can produce human arms, attach them to something, and they will do whatever they need to do to continue the reproduction of the computer. And now you have an independent life form, a life form that instead of having 3 levels of genetic code has 4 levels of genetic code. Our 3 levels of genetic code are DNA, RNA, and proteins. This life form has a fourth one. It's bits on a computer hard drive, and eventually it starts producing human beings, or human-like creature, as I like to call them, human-like creatures that are determined by a genetic code made of bits on a computer that produce slave DNA strands. These slave DNA strands produce slave RNA strands. These slave RNA strands produce slave protein strands. And you have completed the revolutionary phenotype. And not only is it stunning and is it shocking, it's the 4th time it happens on planet Earth. What I just told you happened 4 billion years ago. This is what led to the creation of DNA. And we're about to do it again. And we're about to fuck ourselves in the same way that RNA strands fucked themselves 4 billion years ago. And if you want to know what happens to a life form that creates a revolutionary phenotype, it gets enslaved for the rest of existence. Yeah, and I don't use these words because I say ultimately the entire planet is a eugenics program and it happens all the time. So if you accept the theory of evolution, you accept that it's it comes with living, this idea that you're getting selected for stuff all the time. We get selected for not being too liberal and starting to go dance on the street naked, claiming that we're gay. These things disappear from the ongoing evolutionary walk in the future because the people who don't reproduce don't get selected. So I don't take issue with selection. And that's where I wouldn't use hard and soft eugenics. I would use what I use in the book, which is there's selection and there's printing. If you do selection, you will continue evolving, and selection will happen. There's some people who will not be selected, but your DNA strands will always improve, and they will always get better at making babies. If you start printing, you're starting a revolutionary phenotype.
Right. Okay. I think I get what you're saying there. And I think I use those terms because there are a lot of people who may struggle to grasp these concepts if they're not invested in biology. But yeah, that's a good point. And so the other thing that I come across when I talk about this is a lot of people will say, "Oh, you're against transhumanism." Well, that's just the naturalistic fallacy. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. Do you have a response to that? Because this is one of my bigger questions. Is I think I can understand why they might think that way, but there is something inherently good about things that are naturally occurring in some regards. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think that there are things that are good because of nature. However, I think we need to recognize the fact that we are a product of nature, and the fact that no conscious being of the type that we are could emerge by any other process than an evolutionary process. or an act of creation, but by a being that itself was the result of an evolutionary process. So I don't say that it's a morally true thing. However, I note that since all of the life forms that are conscious and that are of our type, that have some sort of cognitive process, since all of those have been the product of a long chain of evolution, we emerge with some sort of a duty. I feel it like a duty personally to pursue the things that work, to pursue this chain of existence. It is not something that I claim is objectively true, but because we're all stuck in this cone of existence that dates back to a bacteria 4 billion years ago, we might as well continue it. I mean, if you don't continue, other will continue in your place. And so I say, let's care about our own existence. That's all we can do, in fact, because the moment you don't care about your existence, you abolish a chain of beings that has led to these ideas in your brain. So to people who are suicidal, I say, hey, you are the product of a chain of beings that has lasted 4 billion years. There's not a single one that has not succeeded at making babies. So get it together and reproduce this success that has happened for 4 billion years in your back. You just have one more step to do. Do it.
Yeah, and like you said in the book, it's insane how lucky we are to even exist. The chances of ourselves existing is just astronomical. But I see the chance getting a little angsty, so we're going to shift gears to another topic here. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions about race realism. We've come across this quite a bit on the channel. And so the first thing is, a lot of times I struggle to bridge the gap between the reality of evolution and natural selection as it applies to humans and why people should care about racial or genetic replacement. And my first defense is that a values replacement. Obviously, the most common example is the violent behavior of third worlders. But is there something on a biological level that we should worry about when it comes to genetic replacement?
Many things, and that's what a lot of my videos touch upon, which is, yes, the society that you live in is good for your genes, but the society that will be built by other people may not be good for your genes. It's the typical example of white people being so open to the outside that they actually self-destroy. And we've seen a lot of cases of anti-white genocides. We've covered this with Frame Game last Monday. And so what I say is that all of your genes have evolved in a society for at least 100, and some of us more than a few hundred years, where liberty was maintained by outside forces. So your genes, they are adapted to this situation. And that's probably why you're intelligent and why you care about respecting others. You may not be as careful if you had been born 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 500,000 years ago. You might have been a little more violent. You might have been less caring of preserving your institutions. So what I say to people who don't care about getting replaced, well, I tell them the same argument that I tell to the suicidal people. I say, hey, you exist for a reason. It's that everyone in your chain of ancestry was successful. And so you're kind of not an optimized machine, but you're a quite impressive machine for the world that we live in. And so and the same thing goes for our societies. White societies are quite an impressive machine. I mean, we laid asphalt, we laid roads that allow us to go anywhere within our societies. We have all these signs that we respect. It's one thing to have a stop sign. It's another thing to have a population that evolves to actually respect the stop sign and make a stop with their car. And that's what we have. That's the beauty of white civilization. And we have more than this. We have a look into our universe that has never been reached by any conscious creature on this planet. we may be at the apogee of even all life forms in the universe. I mean, what life forms have the equivalent of the selfish genes? What life form has the equivalent of the book I'm writing, which is the revolutionary phenotype? Which life form has ended up understanding everything about themselves down to how did the genetic code emerge? So we have made quite some strides, and these things would not have occurred if we lived in huts and if we wondered if we were going to be alive next week. These things have happened because of a surplus of productivity that was induced by this crazy world we live in which some people can be specialized into creating a camera. Some people are specialized into just creating microphones. And because all of these people had the time to produce so much that then you have people who over specialize like me in just talking. That's absolutely insane.
You're very good at talking, JF.
That I can be paid to talk. It's like, and it's not even me is just a small example. There are people who are expert at talking specific things, like a stand-up comedian. They are specialized at perceiving society in some way to find that little point, that little humorous point in the highly dimensional space that human language is, to find the thing that people will look at and say, ha ha ha, that's funny. It's absolutely insane, and that's what we've created. Now, if you replace yourself with other people, they will do just like the crabs do when they end up stealing a shell from another crab or from another species. They can live in it, but there is no sign that they can reproduce it. And even worse, there is no sign that they can ever take it to the next step. We have made a very special world in white civilization that has changed the face of this earth forever, and in fact changed the face of this earth even in other civilizations who were capable of importing our systems of law, importing our technological discoveries, and eventually they became productive such that even the computers that we invented through our scientific progresses are now being produced by other people than us. Most of them come from Taiwan or from some Asian countries. So that's all beautiful. But if you take people at random who have not demonstrated a high compatibility with this society, you will find yourself being drained toward other directions. And these other directions can be as hard as, well, a complete destruction of our legal system, a complete overtake of our legal systems by democratic forces that will drain the success out of this society to themselves. And you can encourage them by policies that look very simple, like welfare. That sounds good. It sounds good that I don't want people to be suffering and I want to help them. But what we know from biology is that if you help the birds by giving them seeds, you will find yourself with 50 more birds 10 years later begging for 50 more times of seed. And so as long as we refuse to consider the reality of evolution in our handling of policy, we will eventually destroy our societies by not caring about who we bring and who we get replaced by. And the darkest outcomes for this, we've seen it in Haiti, we've covered 6 places in the world where whites became minorities last Monday on my show.
That was a good show.
It ends with genocide. Bad news, it ends with white genocide.
Yeah, and that's a great way to put it. I've thought about trying to summarize it like that. The other way that I think about it a lot is trying to appeal to people's base emotions, because a lot of the concepts that you just talked about and that I talk about a lot on this channel seem to be outside the grasp of the average person. So another way that I like to talk about this replacement is even just the day-to-day things, such as the reintroduction of third world disease into the Western world, such as Ebola or malaria or something, because I have lived for the past 20 years as a white minority in the United States, and I see firsthand the effects of the replacement of whites. You know, I go to work, it's in a very advanced company, and it's whites and Asians. That's it. And then I go outside and I see the destruction of what used to be a 80-90% white city, and it's gone into total ruins. And I say, look around you, this is what happens when you replace the ethnic population that built the society around it. So it's a good way to put it. I did a stream.
Absolutely. I agree with this approach being taken by others, so I'm not critical of it. But because of my own temperament and my kind of megalomaniac attitude, I look for big ideas. I look for descriptions that will survive thousands of years. So I'm more on the intellectual side, but people like Tommy Robinson, they're more like, I'm gonna take a cell phone and I'm gonna go show you the truth of what's happening. I'm not that kind of guy. I see really wide statements about civilization. That's what I'm interested in, but it doesn't mean that the smaller, detailed and emotional approach is not good. It's just a piece of the puzzle.
Right, yeah, and I think, not to blow smoke up my own ass here, but what I like to do is look at people like you and sort of bridge the gap between the average person and the hyper-intellectual, because I think that's what you're best at, is sitting here and speaking and expanding on ideas. And what I like to do is take time afterwards, analyze what you said, and sort of repackage it in a way that's digestible for the average person, which is why I really enjoyed doing those stream synopsises early on.
Absolutely.
And by the way, speaking of streams, please do more comedy. The comedy bit last night on your show was fantastic. I'd love to see more of that. But so,
oh yeah, it's pretty insane that I'm doing comedy. It's when I do comedy, I feel like I'm looking at human society and I'm like, do you really need an artist to show you how to make people laugh, you retards? Yeah, exactly. I shouldn't be doing comedy. Yet I take great pleasure at doing this, and it's I use comedy as a very aggressive tool in the field of ideas. I connect ideas that were not connected before, and I do humor to an audience that was not used to get humor of that kind. I drag some principles from the big comedian, the big leftist comedians that we've known, but I revert it against themselves, and I'm trying to use it really as a way to send arrows right at the right place in the ideology space.
Right, yeah. And so one of the topics that I wanted to touch on is if you had any thoughts about where we're going sort of as a movement. I don't want to say alt-right or dissident right or anything like that, but people who are politically incorrect. Is there something in your view that we need to do in order to take the next step? Because there are some people that I talk to who say, we need people to become journalists, and we need people to become media personalities, and we need more right-wing comedians like Sam Hyde or whatever. Do you think that we should do that, or should we stick to our online spaces, like doing our YouTube shows and things like that?
I think that there's no opposition between these two. It's kind of a false dichotomy that you presented. I think that's exactly where I'm headed, which is, yes, we need right-wing thinking invading other stuff. Like I'm actually thinking about making a far-right cooking show.
I remember you talking about that. That'd be fantastic.
It would be like, the hordes of migrants are coming. They're at the door. What do we have left for ourselves? A 40-pound ribeye steak. Let's cook it.
What is the most right-wing seasoning for your ribeye? Huh? I think it's
exactly.
Yeah. You're not really right-wing if you don't use salt, pepper, and garlic, and that's it. Yeah.
And the trailer intro is like, it's a pan, and then there's the handle of the pan that goes far to the right, and there's an arrow at the extremity of the pan, and it says, "You are here." And then there's a steak that falls in the pan, and it makes.
Oh, if you're not working on that, somebody get to that. That's fantastic.
No, but that illustrates what I think we need to do. We need an invasion of the format of mainstream while keeping the ideas and the motivators behind be our fundamental ideas of existence of people, of all nations wanting to preserve themselves, and the big ideas that have driven the alt-right. So I say this is the direction, but yeah, some people will become physical comedians and stand-up comedians in actual theaters. But also we need to realize that this economy is dying and that most of the things are transferring toward the online world. And it's not a problem if we don't get stand-up comedians to do physical stuff. If the economy of stand-up comedy is falling, let's not care about it. Let's just wait that it completely falls and will be the replacement on YouTube. And our economy is growing. I mean, I remember I started live streaming when there were 4 viewers watching our shows. I was doing all sorts of jokes with people who I don't talk too much anymore, but that's how live streaming started. Look at the growth of the economy and the fact that we now have multiple streams live that are all good. Like, I'm competing with Nick Fuentes. I would not want that it to be that way, but the reality is everyone is going live, and we're splitting pies, but the pies are also growing. So let's keep growing this. And I don't object to journalists in the real world, outside of the online world, continuing their work, but let's not be stubborn with it to the point where we're not being clever about it and we're not being efficient about it. Let's not try to make ticket venues that cost $120 just to go see a YouTube personality that we could have seen right here on the internet for $0.
Right, absolutely. Joshua Snyder says, so do right-wingers cook with? And then he put a gas emoji.
This is exactly all sorts of jokes that I would do around these lines. Like, I would give the public the choice, what do you want? Milk? Water? Or...
Right. And it's good you talk about this false dichotomy, because I talk about this a lot. So many people seem to be absolutists. When I talk about cultivating a group of online intellectuals, they think that this means I'm opposed to IRL activism, which I'm not. I say do both. I think that there are some people who need to sit behind a camera online and talk about things, and there are other people who need to go out there and start, spreading the good word, essentially. And as far as the growth of the pie is concerned, yeah, I mean, my first video went up January 4th of this year, and as of right now, I'm at 1,800 subs. I'm surprised that someone like myself can get that much attention. It's fantastic, and you as well. All of your content is getting massive amounts of views, considering the topics at hand. Which by
Absolutely.
the way, JF has officially won IBS. Just for the record.
Absolutely. I saw this yesterday night. I mean, I didn't do a spectacular show of any kind, but even there, with the relatively just interesting content we were producing, we were bigger than Andy Warski.
Right. Glakun Khan says, please ask JF if and when alt-right opinions will become mainstream. So I'll let you answer that one first, if you want to.
I think they will. I think that people underestimate the intelligence and the kind of complete dedication that people like me have into creating a flow of media in this physical universe for the next 30 years. I will. It will happen, or I'll die trying. That's the answer.
Right.
And if you want to be cheered about this and see the potential for this, go watch the Aiden Paladin video of yesterday about comedy and why is leftist comedy not fun anymore and why is right-wing comedy fun. And you will be absolutely cheered. You will understand that the space of human ideas has been pushed to its extreme on the left. And now everything that's provocative is all on the right. That's a beautiful sandbox for someone like me to play. Because if you're going to be shocked by stuff on the right, well, I'm able to produce that kind of humor. I may not have been a good leftist comedian, but I'm pretty pretty ready to take the challenge to be a right-wing comedian.
I don't know, Jay. If you're not as edgy as Roseanne, I gotta say, you gotta up your edginess.
I'm the edgelord. I'm the one who Roseanne and Elon Musk are trying to copy. They're trying to be me.
Right. I think that as far as his question is concerned, I think it's an inevitability. Not only because humans and culture in particular are inherently reactionary to what is mainstream. There's this endless cycle of, okay, my parents are like this, there's something within us that makes us rebel, and then it changes. So there's going to be a massive shift. And as society degrades, we see this with the current up-and-coming generations of young people. They are tired of being beaten over the head with racial politics that are anti-white, with a destruction of religion and a destruction of traditional values, because those things are the natural order of the world. So there will always be, in my opinion, a shift back to what is natural for humans, in my opinion. Now, there was a question here that I missed. I couldn't slip it in. Bob Arctur says, where does JF think memories are stored in the brain? If they are not stored in the brain, then where? He has a background in this field, if you'd like to answer that question.
Typically, we think of the hippocampus as being at least very important for memory. Now, where are they stored? There are huge debates about this. I don't think that any scientist would tell you today it's stored there. I think that the hippocampus is very important, but the hippocampus itself doesn't contain much, and there's probably lots of cortical area in the frontal and prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, that are probably needed to retrieve memory and strategize about what it is that you need to remember exactly. And so what we know, if you destroy the hippocampus, what happens? Well, a person will completely remember everything that happened before the hippocampus was affected, but they will not be able to record new memories. So this tells you, okay, the memories are probably not stored in the hippocampus. They are probably able to survive somewhere else in the brain, but they don't get to become memories if the hippocampus is disabled, is knocked down through some means. So this is what we know right now about memory. Of course, memory itself needs to be divided. When people think of memory, they tend to think about autobiographical memory. So my name is JF. I have this girlfriend and this is her name. And I have this and that in my life and this happened yesterday. That's all sequential memory. It's a special type of memory, and the hippocampus is very important for recording these events, but apparently not for storing them long term. It's like the hippocampus, it gets there, the information is in there, it gets processed and evaluated for its importance, and then it probably gets dumped somewhere else in the brain. Now, there are all sorts of things that are other forms of memories, including motor learning. We became better with our hands and with everything we do physically in our life, and that's a huge part of memory. We were better car drivers. We understood better how to use a knife after we've used it a few times. And this probably operates as a completely separate system in the brain. It's a form of training, probably of cortical areas in relation to reward areas like the dorsal striatum and all sorts of other areas that encode the pleasure that you experience when you succeed at doing something. These areas probably coordinate all together to form a better and better human beings in terms of being able to handle tools and perform actions.
Fascinating. It's a little bit outside my scope, but I assume that he'll take that answer. Let's see, how much time do you have, JF? I don't want to keep you here too long.
I'm here for as long as there's interesting things to discuss.
Oh, I've got a million things. I don't know if we'll cover it all, but talking about your show a little bit more, who in all of your career as a media person, who is the most intelligent person you've had on your show? What is the best show that you've ever done or been a part of, do you think?
The most intelligent is probably Kurt Doolittle. Kurt Doolittle has a complete mapping of everything in science and philosophy, and has a properly ordered view of it from first principles to elementary laws of logic to empiricism, to to coherentism and the concepts of mathematics, and he understand all of this, and then empiricism driving him to understand the physical universe, and then understand that we're biological creatures, and then understand that these biological creatures tell themselves stories about things being good and things being bad, and he has then a good handling of moral truths and how they relate to this whole system. This guy has the complete cloud of knowledge perfectly aligned in his brain. This is the most intelligent person I've seen in my life. And I've talked to Nobel Prizes, to some of the greatest minds of our time, Harvard professors, leading scientists in all fields. This guy is the most intelligent thing I've ever seen. Now, that doesn't mean it makes the show necessarily interesting, like in terms of views or in terms for the audience, but this, I could perceive it in him. Interesting shows.
Your either that or what is your favorite show that you've ever been a part of? Or I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but the audience is curious in knowing.
The thing is, at this point, there are so many.
Right.
I like all of these shows where I do these little trailer sketches. The one I did yesterday, that's the kind of very edgy humor that really turns me on in terms of being satisfied as a creator. So I would say I would point toward this one, but at the same time, I look back at other trailers I've done, and they were all digging very deep arrows into what I want to communicate in this world. And then I think of guests like Richard Spencer, Styx. I think of people like Nick Fuentes. All of these, I couldn't order them. I just really love what I do every day.
I would say the same thing. It's impossible to narrow down to one single thing that you've ever produced, because there's so many good properties of all different types of videos and live streams that we all do as content creators.
Yeah.
Now, is there one live show or video that you regretted making or that you didn't like or you weren't happy with?
Good question. Is there one that I regret making? No, I've never deleted a video, and I'm not ashamed of any of them.
I know you I know you said previously that you shouldn't regret things that you do.
Yeah, I'm very low on the regret scale because I always see any state of the world in which I am, and I tend to be a happy guy with my current life. So then I look back and I'm like, well, all of these things were needed to get me there. So it's very hard for me to regret things, really like being ashamed of it. No, I stand by all of my creations. And sometimes I've been in Warski Live episodes that were bad, but I don't regret my contribution to them, because I'm the kind of guy who's so autistic that if Andy starts doing something completely stupid, I'm just going to say, I dissociate myself from this joke. It's terrible. You suck. So everything I feel inside, I drop it on the public space. I'm very honest. My mind is very open like this. So it's very rare that in the end I will regret, because if I don't like it, I will say it at the moment.
Gotcha. Good answer. Going back a little bit here, Vlad says, is the existence of an original replicator required for a life form to emerge, or can a world filled with random phenotypic machines eventually produce a replicator and then a life form?
Well, that's I'm not sure that your question makes sense, because an original replicator, well, how would this original replicator have been produced? Well, they would probably be random phenotypic machines of the universe that contains this replicator. So whatever is the first replicator of a line, it has to have been a phenotypic machine of the physical laws that created it, and the fact that these physical laws just so happen to be arranged such as to make copies of it. So I would say your question is a misleading false dichotomy. Now, don't take it personal, Vlad. I like you, and it's not an insult. But your question would need rephrasing. However, there is this question remaining. The first replicator, I think that with my book, we can say with certainty that the first replicator that we think of as replicators was a self-replicating protein, either self-replicating by itself or using RNA machines to RNA enzymes to replicate the strand of protein. Now the question remains, was it really the first replicator? And it's very likely that it wasn't. However, I don't think of the next step of replicators as being replicators that just disappeared, like not another replicator in terms of another chemical. What I think happens is that we will eventually discover within the rules of the universe that quantum physics is underlined by the theory of evolution, and there's actually already a theory of quantum Darwinism. I think we will discover more and more within quantum Darwinism, maybe up to a point where we will say, okay, the elementary particles or even fields of the universe are relying on a replicator-based process, and therefore the laws that we know of as quantum physics today probably rely on biological evolution, but in a very weird way, in a way that we don't tend to think of as biology. I think that this will happen at the fundamental level of quantum physics. It's already happening to a certain extent by the formulation of quantum Darwinism in, I believe, 2009 or 2012. And we're going to make progress. And just like we invented Darwinism in biological science without knowing that it was DNA doing all of it. And right now, physics is pretty much at this initial point that we were with Charles Darwin. They know that there are evolutionary processes at play that lead to the existence of various particles in the universe. They call it quantum Darwinism. Now, maybe one day we will do the same that we did with biology. We will end up finding the replicator that underlies all of it. In the case of biology, it was DNA. In the case of quantum physics, I don't know what it will be. But that would be an interesting development of quantum physics. Another development where I think that the theory of evolution might very well play is a theory of evolution at the supra-universe level. I think we may very well end up realizing that the universe as we know it, space-time, the 13 billion year old thing that we observe as the universe, is probably just a baby among many others. And we're just in a chain of continuously recreating universes, and we may just be one generation of it. This whole 13 billion years thing that we call space-time may very well be a single generation in a system that has evolved in a dimension or in a structure that we still ignore. That's the theory of baby universes, and possibly the point where other universes emerge may very well be in black holes, as it turns out.
All right, I hope that answers your question there, Vlad. Ella May says, and this I'll take this question, then we'll move on to another topic. His research method. Let's see. Hold on. Sorry, I'm trying to evaluate what this means here. All right. Anyway, let's shift gears here into politics. So I want to get your perspective on this. What to you is liberty? And how do you define it? What are your first principles? I'm sure you've talked about this before, but I'd like to talk to you about it.
So liberty to me is not a first principle, and I don't view liberty as a moral realist. I'm not like Stefan Molyneux or many libertarians who say, well, liberty is the real thing in morality, and it's like you have to converge toward the nap or you're wrong. Liberty to me is a contract. It's a local space that you can decide to enter in with competing people, such that you deal the parameters under which you will not intervene or stop their actions. So liberty is the space of actions that you've agreed upon with your opponents and competitors, such that you all agree that you will not stop others from doing that. And typically, the way our societies work is we assume you are free unless we specify by law. And so the contractual arrangement is actually the anti-liberty one, except constitutional principles. Something like the First Amendment does define liberty of speech in a positive fashion. It says you will not legislate against freedom of speech. But most laws are done in the reverse fashion. Most laws says you will not do that. You will not steal from someone else. You will not kill someone else. So most laws keep you from doing actions. And to me, the space of liberty is the ensemble of actions that can be taken without violating the contractual arrangement with your democratic partners.
Right. So you view liberty, I think, in a slightly different way to some of the other libertarians. I was speaking to one yesterday. It was a good conversation, but it seems to me, in particular, people like Stefan Molyneux, who I still watch, I still enjoy. We widely differ on politics, but I still think he's got a good analytical mind. But it seems to me that the reason why they're libertarians is because they have a moral realist framework in which libertarianism is the only morally just political framework they can work within. Now, would you say that you're a moral skeptic, that you fall underneath that category, moral nihilism, something like that?
Yeah, I don't like the word moral skeptic. However, it seems that things like the Stanford Encyclopedia ended up using this word instead of moral nihilism. I preferred nihilism because I do an affirmative statement about the behavior of any complex system, which is there is no truth about how a system should act. So that's what I call moral nihilism, and that's what I am.
So how does moral nihilism fit within the libertarian framework? Like I said, it seems to me that the reason why people are libertarians is because they view it from a moral realist perspective. Do these two things work together? Can you be a moral nihilist and still apply libertarian principles?
Yes, you can, but I'm the only one who seems to have done it very seriously and who seems to be defending this position, at least in the current intellectual landscape. So, what I say is there is no truth about how we should behave, but I'm a biological being, and I have needs and I have things I excel at, and I have some sort of contract that I'd like to arrange with people around me such that my liberty is preserved. Now, I'm not saying that I'm right with respect to someone else who would say I don't want my liberty to be preserved. I'm saying what I find interesting in this world, what I prefer, and that's where I say it's not true, but it's something I prefer. I would prefer living in a free society. I would prefer freely associating with people who want to reciprocate my desire to leave them free with their desire to leave me free. And as a being, while I cannot state truths about morality, I can state preferences. So all you have to do really is reframe all of the statements of truth made about the nap and say this is something I prefer.
Right, and that's what I was thinking when I was formulating these questions. That this seems to be more of a preference that you have, and that a preference you would rather see that the world has around you. That we have this sort of voluntary cooperation. Now, I actually like that answer better than your standard issue libertarian moral absolutist. Let's say that libertarianism is the only moral system in which we can live under. I like yours better because a lot of politics is a preference. I think that, and this is where we might differ slightly, when it comes to moral realism, I think that we need to understand that I think there is a way in which we can study moral judgments, but that they're not necessarily absolutely true. They're true insofar as we have a preference for things, which is why I like your answer so much. And my biggest issue is that today a lot of moral relativism has led to things like open borders and a denial of biology and race realism. So as a reaction to that, I have to kind of pull things back in and say, hey, no, we can study morality and we can study behavior and we can come to a conclusion that says, hey, this behavior is objectively better than this behavior. Is it moral? I don't know. Some things are preferences. It's such a wide ranging field of philosophy, and I'm not trained in philosophy at all, which is why I like talking about this and getting other people's opinions. So,
But even the word better, I mean, I guess then you would say better in the sense of a preference rather
right,
than better in an objective sense.
right. It's objective in the sense that I have a moral value hierarchy, and there are things on that hierarchy that I prefer over others, and I can tell you why I prefer them, and we could start from there if I'm having a conversation about moral preferences. But my main concern is that people nowadays, and this is the problem I have with leftists, is that they think that we can never make a moral judgment ever, or that our moral judgments are just purely emotional, that we don't truly have preferences. Behavior doesn't matter at all. It's just, oh, it's a social construct or whatever. So this is what I'm reacting against, is this form of leftist thought.
Yeah, and there's this weird reflex that people have, and I always call them on it, which is anytime you express preferences, they say, "Oh, it's emotional." Uh, and this is aimed at often discrediting the ID, but not all expressed IDs come from emotions. I express things all the time on the public space where I don't feel emotional about it. I don't have a personal experience about it. I'm just dropping either the truth or dropping something that I believe from my intellectual process and rational processes that it would do a good society if we organized it this way or this way. And people dismiss this as emotional. The reality is it doesn't matter if there's an emotion underlying your speech or not. It doesn't matter. We're all beings with equal rights on our society, at least. And if some of our ideas are motivated by emotion, if genes have found it's practical to make an interface between your brain and the world, which includes some personal experience and subjective experience, such as emotions, so be it. It doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. I'm just looking through the chat here. There was a question. Oh yeah. What do you think about Jordan Peterson? I can give my answer if you have any thoughts on him.
Well, Jordan Peterson, he's such a old style guy when you look at it, because preachers of self-care of that kind, it's all been seen before. There's he puts a little mythological aspect to it, an intellectual aspect to it, being an academic formally, but really the essence of his message of taking yourself in your own hands is something that we've seen since the 70s. And I don't object to this happening. It's not the kind of help that I need. And so that already bars a part of Jordan Peterson's contribution for me to be intellectually stimulated by. Now, what are the other branches of Jordan Peterson? There's this self-help. I don't care. And I don't care if people enjoy it. If you do need that kind of self-help speech, go for it. Go watch Jordan Peterson and take your life into your own hands. I don't, because I have all the aspects of my personality already pre-built to be successful without needing that kind of encouragement. Now, the other contribution of Jordan Peterson is this ride on, again, something older than Jordan Peterson, anti-SJWism, a wave of thinking that has passed over the internet for the last 10 years, since the very beginnings of YouTube up to a year ago. That was the big intellectual thing. Let's be against feminism. So sometimes I'm wondering, why is Jordan Peterson doing this? Is that to surf on the remaining waves, like Crowder surfs on the remaining wave of anti-feminism? Maybe. But again, not an original contribution by Jordan Peterson, and not something, although he's very intelligent, so he does a good job. I saw him argue with the TV host woman, I don't remember her name. I mean, he does, and I saw the Sargon video analysis of this, and Sargon does point toward unspoken things that were underlying this conversation. And I think he sees right through it. And it's true. Jordan Peterson has a good layer behind what he says that does hold scrutiny. So he does it very good, but not an original contribution.
I would say the same thing. Initially, when I first found out about him, when he became sort of popular, is that, hey, his message about self help is pretty good, but his railing against identity is not good. So I think he's drawing in a lot of people who sort of venerate him. It's like a cult of personality if you ever talk to Peterson fans, and they seem to take everything that he says at face value or just flat out believe it from the get go without actually looking into it. So I think on the one hand, his self help message is good, but his views on politics outside of his ideas about communism are detrimental to all of us as a whole, because identity politics is very important. Um, Sorry.
Absolutely. And that's the third thing I wanted to say about him. A total failure on identity politics in recognizing the future, but I don't blame him. First, he's born in another world. He doesn't have the mind to care about the kind of stuff that I care about and that younger people start caring about. He's born as a Canadian. I don't know if it's boomer or close to the boomer generation. I mean, these people have been heavily brainwashed from all levels of government for decades. They will never change. You just have to wait for them to die. But then that's the sad thing, which is that he has this power over a certain audience, but he won't use it to give them the keys that they need to understand about the demographic challenges that are coming in 50 years, in 100 years. And he could have done it because he has the intelligence and he has the understanding, presumably, of the demographic reality. But that's where intellectuals like me will outdo Jordan Peterson. I'm telling you right away. The world, as it deploys in face of you for the next 30 years, first, Jordan Peterson will die. And I will not. I will still be alive for many decades after Jordan Peterson's die. And as the physical universe just proves me right again and again, and people go back to my videos of, I mean, by then it will be 10 years or 20 years ago, and they say, whoa, JF told us all of this. Yeah, so the ideas of Jordan Peterson will run out as soon as the physical universe proves him that identity politics, if you don't care about it, it will care about you. And it will either be grave consequences for the white people that he's refusing to inform about this, or it will be that white people will take themselves together before dramatic situations occur, and they will impose the fact of their existence and their right to exist on the world. But that's why I'm not scared about. A lot of people say, Jeff, why don't you have more views? Why don't you approach Sargon or Jordan Peterson? I don't care. I state the truth, and I wait for the world to deploy in front of me, such that you'll realize that the facts that the predictions I've been making in my life were pretty solid. And so the world time is on my side, not on these guys' side. By the time Sargon is done with YouTube and has retired, by the time Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins will all be dead, I will still be alive, and I will have the truth stated on the public space years before it happens.
Yeah, and an addendum to that, I see him. What did Le Perhomme say here? From what I've witnessed, he's a net big positive, pushing elementary trad values and a disgust towards neo-Marxism to big numbers. A great gateway to us, despite his efforts to prevent it. In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. I see a lot of people, like, let's say Tommy Robinson, for example. A lot of people say, oh, he's a Zionist shill, things like that. But he is still, and like Jordan Peterson, they're an amazing gateway to further ideas. As soon as you get your foot in the door of non-mainstream politics, you should be open to all of them. So I know a lot of people who went from watching Jordan Peterson videos to watching videos like the ones that you and I make, and that's quite a leap, some people would believe, but that's how it works. There is this political pipeline that you fall into as soon as you get involved with people like that. So to disparage him, I wouldn't want to. I would say keep doing what he's doing, just be careful of his anti-identity rhetoric, and that eventually people will fall into our space on the internet and fall with our ideas, so to speak.
I agree with you, but I'm also critical of attacking communism so much because it points to the wrong enemy, I believe. There are influences in our society that need to be called out and that don't fall under the concept Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And no, the idea of Marxism is not the only problem with society. The problem with society passes through a use of, yes, identity politics, yes, some form of Marxism and social justice, but also all use of the government and of private corporations to further the goal of invading on people's liberties, on people's freedom to think what they want to think, to do what they want to do, and to be efficient in doing so, and to have the tools around them so that this efficiency is not impeded upon by, yes, social justice warriors, but also very regular people who have this drive inside of them, not even in the form of Marxist ideas, but in the form of political preferences that are hostile to the state of liberty that we want for our society.
Right. So on that note, my audience is screaming at me to bring up something with you as far as politics is concerned. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I am a proponent of third position politics. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept or what that means. If you'd like to talk about it, that'd be great.
What is it?
Well, the third position is a political reaction to the perceived threat of completely free, unhinged capitalism and the horrors of communism and Marxism. The third position, essentially, from my understanding, we want to take the very best of capitalism and the very best of what would be considered classical or right-wing socialism and combine them together. And what that means is that we have private property is an absolute, it's a naturally part of the natural order of things, but at the same time, there may be instances in which the state may need to manage the economy in some ways to preserve the interests of the nation state, or if you're like me, in the interest of the race. This is essentially what it is, and most people may understand it as fascism, but fascism is a distinction within that umbrella term of third position. I'm not a fascist. I'm much more of I want to say National Socialist, but there's a caveat to that in which I don't care what the politics are. I'm more than happy to have libertarianism if it promotes the survival of our in-group and things like that. And the only reason I talk about politics is because, like I said, I have a preference towards how things should be run. So if you have any thoughts on that, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a strong opinion. I want a goal. My goal is to converge toward a state of liberty. So I'm much more of a libertarian. However, I recognize that getting toward a libertarian state will require what we may characterize as fascistic-like interventions. I mean, as long as there's going to be people keeping you from being free, you're going to have to push these people away or carry them by helicopter or whatever it is that you need to do, you know? As Up says, if someone starts talking about socialism or communism, they need to be physically removed.
Right.
So as long as, so I'm not a kind of, it's not like I wouldn't do actions that could be considered as state-based, because I recognize that being in an imperfect world, getting toward a state of maximized liberty may take some time and it may take some interventions, and I'm willing to use the power of the state in a situation where I'm obligated to. And even in a libertarian order, I'm willing to have a kind of quasi-state, at least for the implementation of law. So I fall probably within the minarchic category. So no, I don't object to these things, but in the long run, building an entire nation on just this concept of the interest of the nation, it can lead to some crazy stuff. It can lead to people, to the right of the individual people to dispose of their liberty to be impeded upon in the interest of the nation. So the way I see it is more like a libertarian order would be my goal, with a strong constitution that states the people of this land exists for these people, and it exists for the continued existence of all of their descendants. So we push immigration on this side, and we say, yeah, the goal of people in this land is to reproduce freely, and that's one of our first principles.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I that was my primary concern with libertarianism, is that it's not enough to actually secure the liberties that they talk about so much, and that there may be a state, or a period in time in which you may have to intervene, using the coercion of the state in order to eventually protect those liberties. The other issue I have with classical libertarianism is, it appears to me, through all of the reading that I've done, that the logical conclusion of this moral framework is anarcho-capitalism. Now, obviously, you differ from them in your moral philosophy, which I like, but a lot of people I talk, oh yeah, I was a libertarian for 5 years, and now I'm an anarcho-capitalist, and of course, that's not going to work. So that's my primary concern with libertarianism. It seems to draw people towards a state in which anarcho-capitalism will never work, and that to me seems dangerous, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I'm more in the strand of Up and Kurt Doolittle to some extent, because Kurt cares about the commons. That's not how I would phrase it, and I know that if you start caring about the commons, then you cultivate in your population genes of people who want to use this excuse to actually drag it to them. The same way we see all these social workers getting paid for I don't know what by our governments, and the academia that keeps growing, and the doctor
Yeah.
that keeps demanding more. The minute you start caring for commons, then you have people dragging it toward themselves. So I wouldn't phrase it like Kurt Doolittle, but I would simply say that as long as the minimal state of liberty that we all agreed upon must require some sort of a part of our economy, a part of our effort, then yes, I'm willing to have a mini state of police that will enforce the laws, that will respect a very well designed constitution. Ultimately, I think we because it's not a current political subject, like no one thinks about modifying constitutions in our country, and that's sad. And I think that ultimately we need to think much more about the relation between a constitution and the birthing country, and we need to care a lot about how constitutional principles get deployed over hundreds of years. Luckily, we have examples, we have our own histories, and so we can do better the next time we write a constitution.
Right, and that's what I want, at least here in the United States, is to take the existing Constitution and strengthen it to a point where we don't have leftist judges reinterpreting the Bill of Rights, the foundation of the country. There shouldn't be any interpretation. The state exists only to enumerate these natural laws and to further the interests of the group. As far as state intervention is concerned, I'm really interested in this concept that I've termed, and other people have termed, which is right-wing socialism. Are you familiar with that concept at all?
No.
Okay, well, let me lay it out for you. So, essentially, what it is, when people classically think of socialism, they think of, oh, it's just free welfare, everybody, it's all equality and stuff like this. The difference between the left and the right, as I see it, is that the left is hell-bent on equalizing outcomes of all different people within their nation. The right is inherently focused on hierarchy and the naturally occurring hierarchy of human beings and of nature as a whole, right? And so when we think about a right-wing socialistic system, it's simply using the state's communal funds directed in the interest of a people. But a caveat to that is that there are very strict requirements for how these communal funds are used. For example, I would be in favor of a nationalized healthcare system, and with private on the side if you want to pay for it, but a nationalized healthcare system that has strict requirements. And if you are going to take money from the communal funds in order to receive healthcare, you have to serve the collective in some way, shape, or form. You have to spill blood, which is to say you have to serve in the military in combat or something like that. you have to create blood, which is to say you should have lots of children, or you have to provide labor for the state in some way, shape, or form. Is all that making sense?
Yeah, but to me, that's socialism. And what I say to that is the free market can do that very well. It does it with money. Exchanging certain services against other is what the free market is good at with a good currency. So what I say is your health system. What if 90% of your population wants that? Why would you impose it to the 10% that don't want it? And so I say, this doesn't have to be a state system. It could very well be a private corporation operating for the 90% of people that want it, and everything would remain free. The problem is if you impose this system on the 10% that don't want it, then they find themselves in a system of they're essentially getting their money stolen because they didn't want your health services.
Right. Yeah, I understand that position. I think this is more of we're getting into LARPing idealistic territory here. I'm simply outlining some things that I would like to see in a homogenous country at some point in which we work together as a collective to protect one another. And some people take this too far as to say, oh, well, we need a social credit system and we have to remove all private industry, and I don't go that far in particular. But this is what the concept of right-wing socialism is, and I've been working on trying to put together this theory, so I wanted your input on that. But
I take issue with the system of incentives that you develop in this for the same reason that there are bad ideas for the leftist. The incentives that you create, it will depend on the particular law that you decide, but some of your laws will end up killing a lot of your people. Some of your laws will end up favoring a lot of non-performing people making babies, because you did mention that you could pay back people who, in some way, you could return favor to people for making babies. Well, the free market is the best handler of this because it rewards the people who are successful for a reason. The reason being that they produce stuff that others want, and those are the only people you want to incentivize at making babies.
Right. I can understand that. Yeah, and then that's the other big issue with this is, of course, subsidizing those who are degenerating the gene pool, so to speak. We don't want to incentivize certain people who have genetic defects or whatever to produce, obviously. But as a reaction to what we're seeing right now with incredibly low birth rates in the white community, in the white population, and various issues with globalized capitalism, I think it might be worth examining something different. And one of the incentives that I really liked in order to increase birth rates in the short run is this program in which a nuclear family, a mother and a father who are productive citizens who are attempting to have children, as soon as they are expecting, they can apply for a small state loan that may cover some of the initial cost of having children, and they'll have to pay back the loan with no interest, and as they have children, portions of this loan will be removed. So essentially the state is paying a small fee and you're getting, let's say, 4 or 5 brand new taxpayers out of it. And I think that would be one incentive that we could use the state in order to increase birth rates in the short term, because we are at such a loss right now.
Personally, I mean, you can always make the non-libertarian argument in the current society, because you can make the case, well, in current society, there's so much violations of right, and people are so being incentivized in crazy ways that doing it a little less crazy would make sense. Right. But ultimately, as an ideologue and as a political thinker, I just object to artificial state-based incentives as a whole, because think about the other things that you will create with this. Well, you're going to have people who are torn apart between the free market and between making babies. Now, what do you think will happen? The most successful people on the free market, for them, the amount of money that you would loan them means nothing. And so the successful people are not encouraged to make babies by your system. Your system creates an incentive for the least successful whites to make babies. Those for whom going to McDonald's will get them work for McDonald's will get them just as much money as taking your loans. And so they're going to say, well, I'm going to take the loan. I'm not going to go to work to McDonald's. And so you created an incentive system that leads you in your next generation to have more human beings that are incapable of interacting with an evolving free market that requires more and more talent. So it's a very dirty thing in the long run.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I appreciate that. So I did a video on this. If anyone's curious, it's called Right-Wing Socialism ? And you can go in there and look about this. To kind of end things off, because we've been going for about 2 hours here, we're getting towards the end. Some final questions. What is the ideal future that you would want to see for your children?
I would want to see a state that is small, a secessionist world. We don't need to be in countries of 300 million people. It doesn't make sense. There's no function for it. In a world where there's some sort of free trade or bilateral arrangement between various countries, there are beautiful cultures in Europe that emerge from countries that are small, like Japan, as small as Japan. And that's what I would want to see for my country. I don't think I will see it. I think that Quebec will die. And so as a kind of consolation prize, I would like my message on YouTube to go to other white civilization. Me being part of a dying civilization, a civilization that will not survive the next few generations, that will be unable to pass its language very soon, and that will eventually be forgotten by anything alive on this planet. I would like at least to see another civilization like the US catch this message. And at least if I cannot have saved my own people, I would like to see a secession of some states of America to protect the American lifestyle that used to be spread throughout 50 years or 100 years ago. And this culture, of course, I don't want to paralyze it in the past, but I would like it to preserve the idea of American liberty and of the reality of the need for our genes to survive and to be part of the human diversity on this planet.
All right, very good answer. I would say something similar. I would hope to see a secession movement in America as well. I did a video on the American ethno-state where I examined, I think it was 36 different points of contention I have with how this might be possible technically and what we need to look out for. And I would love to see something like that where each group has their own smaller state in which to exist, because you're right, living in a country of 330 plus million people is just, it's a disaster. Not everyone can get what they want. You have people who are, as far as I'm concerned, on the other side of the planet, you know, over in states, 5 states away, who are imposing their ideas about how politics should play out onto me, and it really frustrates me, of course. So the future hopefully would be a point in which our people are free to rule themselves in some way, shape, or form, and to revive the real Americana culture that I'm familiar with growing up where I've grown up. So chat, if you have any final questions for JF, please leave them here now before we sign off. Vlad says, can you give me one reason why I shouldn't get my family to move into northern Quebec, buy a satellite, and start an online shop to make money and provide for my family?
Well, that's pretty much what I did. I think he's joking and he's describing my life.
Gotcha. So we'll look for some more questions here. Create a white ethno-state of northern U.S. with white parts of Canada. Yeah, pretty much. Did you see my last question? No, I did not, Shadow in the Mask. Can you put it in the chat again, or let me look for it here? Let's see. JF, when will you do song requests again?
I can do song requests now, but there will be a viewership drop. Every time I sing, I lose 20% of the viewership. That's the amount of people that cannot tolerate my singing.
Let's see. I see Kurt Doolittle as a guy who's just thought through every single part of his logical system. Ask JF who's the most creative or highest raw intelligence he's had on the show. We might have already covered that. I don't know if you want to answer
Yeah,
that one.
it was Kurt Doolittle.
I think I know the answer to this one, but Bullrock asks, JF, do you have political aspirations for the near future? I missed if you said it earlier.
No, there are projects I would join if they occurred, but I think that most of my ideas are not in vogue. I'm not MTV enough. I'm not I'm not Lazy Green enough. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting as the future deploys, but also I'm not a political activist. I'm a media guy, so it will all depend on how the physical universe develops in front of me. I might join things that exist, but I'm not going to initiate stuff. That's not my role in society. I work at the level of ideas, and that's what I will do for the rest of my life. So people who are inviting me to marches and all, I can cover these things, but I'm almost not even a journalist, a political journalist. I'm really a philosopher of the public space, and so I'm not gonna be engaged in active politics, especially not when all of the options that are put in front of us are all terrible.
Right. That's kind of what I was expecting your answer to be. I see you more as an intellectual leader rather than the man on the street with the camera like Tommy Robinson. And Vlad was asking if I could expand on the Tommy Robinson situation. It's kind of already been covered at this point. I don't know if there's any updates on exactly what's happening to him. Last I heard, he was actually sentenced to serve the 13 months that was suspended earlier. I don't know if you heard about that. Okay.
That's pretty much it.
And as far as the song requests are concerned, we would have at least one viewer because Joshua Snyder says, I loved it when JF sang Torn for me. LMA says, how long would you continue your YouTube career?
As far as it's possible, I think it will be until I die. I don't see myself stopping. The amount of success that I have, given all of the conditions that would be against it. Like, I have a French accent. I'm freaking autistic. I'm not a very social guy. I'm very philosophical and in depth. Given that I've succeeded at the level that I did with all of these handicap, you have to think that this is a good job for me. That somehow I'm touching something that is very good in what I create, so that these handicap don't look strong enough to stop me. Therefore, I conclude that I'm good at what I do, and I'll continue doing that as long as possible.
Absolutely.
Now, maybe at some point my ideas will become irrelevant and I won't understand why, and the world will change in front of me, but I don't see it coming very soon.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I would say that people need to have a little bit more self-reflection nowadays to really understand what they are good at. You need to understand your faults and say, hey, I suck at this, this, and this, which means my job in this movement is better served here or here. I think that's really important. A lot of people say, oh, well, if you're not an activist IRL, you're not really a part of this movement. It's like, no, that's ridiculous. It's like, no, we each all have our strengths and weaknesses. We all need to play to that. Cordy asks, will you do a show with Cultured Thug? I assume that's what he means. Are you familiar with Cultured Thug?
Yeah, I hear his name a lot. I need to contact him. It's just, does he have a Twitter?
He doesn't have a Twitter. I have him on Skype if you'd like to talk to him. We've done...
Oh, yeah, if you can give me a Skype, because every time someone is not on Twitter, it's so much harder for me to contact them because I forget and I don't log on my Skype always, so...
Right, let me just leave a note for myself. Message CT for JF. Yeah, because we've done 3 videos together talking about how to achieve political power and then what to do once we get there. So I think he's a lot more knowledgeable in that field than I am. I think when it comes to the third position, it'd be a good conversation if you're interested. Let's see. We'll take a couple more questions here. Can you ask JF what he thinks about Nuremberg-style race laws? Does he think that they would be an appropriate measure to implement in a hypothetical ethno-state?
What are the Nuremberg laws?
Essentially, you had... The state was looking at your... Not your genealogy, your like family tree and saying, okay, if you have this one Jewish person in this far back in your tree, you're this percentage Jewish, and
Oh yeah.
basically laws saying that hey, if you're this percent race, you can't marry into the people who are more ethnically German, essentially.
I mean, to me, these laws are wrong in my libertarian ideal. However, I understand that this kind of law emerges because of historical violations of right and because precisely like the society that we have right now, people have not consented to have so many migrants. And so what will you have at some point in this society? You'll have people saying, well, my ancestors did not consent, I did not consent, therefore a reparation is needed. And the reparation may be one of exclusion or a politics of exclusion that may emerge as they are decided by whoever makes the decision. So on the one hand, I say it's not something I would want in an ideal society. On the other hand, I say these things may be needed when to some society in their perspective because people start being present in their country against their consent.
Yeah, I'm even though I'm much more of a racial purist than most, I still don't think those laws are going to work. The amount of bureaucracy that you're going to need to implement such a law is just insane. And this is one of the problems I have with the modern day state is that it's too large. There's too much paper pushers. We're wasting money on people who sit around, being bureaucrats all day. And I think if you tried to implement a law in which you have to look into people's family history and classify them as being this percent race or that percent race, you're going to get bogged down in the system and it's not going to work effectively.
I mean, the way I was seeing this in the future is possibly in a very small secessive state, you might have a society of 7 million people and things might become doable. Not so much to control everyone, but just to say who we accept as an entry, who do we form this new society with. You might have some racial consideration, or even at some point, DNA tests might be so easy that you may actually just order the DNA test. It might be so cheap that you'll get your response and you set a threshold and you say, we want to live together, people of that genetic nuclei, and you can be very loose or very strict about the nuclei. It doesn't matter to me, but we might reach a point where it's very easily doable.
Yeah, I think that internally, applying these laws internally to your population may be a challenge if we're talking about a hypothetical ethnostate where everyone is already fairly one race or homogenous. Turning it externally, I think, is a necessity. If you're bringing people in, you need to be able to ensure that they are of the same stock as the rest of the nation. So there's a differentiation between there. Vlad again says, favorite baby names? That'll be the last question. Favorite baby names, JF?
Favorite baby name? Well, I'm not gonna answer because it's too private.
Gotcha. That's what I figured it would be. So, all right. So we're gonna end the stream there, guys. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'd like to thank JF for coming on to the show. Any final thoughts, JF, on what we've been talking about?
No, I think you have a very good. We dig through some deep ideas, so it was really a pleasure for me to talk to you. And anytime we can do it again.
All right, sounds good. With that, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye bye.